15 years after divorcing her husband on false accusations, billionaire Brenda Anderson receives a call that stops her heart. Wesley Castillo's voice is barely a whisper. "Brenda, I'm dying, and you're the only person who can help." What she doesn't know yet is that the help he needs will shatter the secret she's kept for 15 years. If this story resonated with you, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Because tomorrow, I will be giving you another story just as crazy as this one, and you don't want to miss it. Now, let us begin. Brenda Anderson had built her empire on instinct sharper than any algorithm, but the one time she trusted suspicion over her heart, it would cost her the only man who ever saw past her fortune. The evening had unfolded like countless others in their marriage. Wesley Castillo stood in the kitchen of their penthouse, not the formal one her chef used, but the smaller one tucked away where they actually lived, his hands dusted with flour, as he shaped empanadas, the way his grandmother had taught him. The late sun caught the gold of his wedding band as he worked. "You know we have a Michelin-starred chef downstairs," Brenda said from the doorway, still in her suit from the boardroom, watching him with the kind of peace most billionaires never find. He looked up, that devastating smile that had nothing to do with wanting anything from her. "Your chef makes food for clients. I make food for my wife." That was Wesley. He had this gift for making her billion-dollar world feel small enough to hold in two hands, for turning a penthouse into a home instead of a tax write-off. When Brenda had first encountered him at a gallery opening, he'd been wearing a suit that probably cost what she spent on coffee. But he hadn't known who she was, and when she'd mentioned her company's name, he'd simply asked what she actually did there. Not what it was worth, not how many people she employed. What did she do that made her eyes light up? Their marriage had raised eyebrows at every level. Her board had used the phrase liability assessment 9 times in one emergency meeting. Her father had suggested she was confusing love with loneliness. But Brenda had never been more certain of anything in her calculated life. 15 years after divorcing her husband on false accusations, billionaire Brenda Anderson receives a call that stops her heart. Wesley Castillo's voice is barely a whisper. "Brenda, I'm dying, and you're the only person who can help." What she doesn't know yet is that the help he needs will shatter the secret she's kept for 15 years. Brenda Anderson had built her empire on instinct sharper than any algorithm, but the one time she trusted suspicion over her heart, it would cost her the only man who ever saw past her fortune. The evening had unfolded like countless others in their marriage. Wesley Castillo stood in the kitchen of their penthouse, not the formal one her chef used, but the smaller one tucked away where they actually lived, his hands dusted with flour as he shaped empanadas the way his grandmother had taught him. The late sun caught the gold of his wedding band as he worked. "You know we have a Michelin-starred chef downstairs," Brenda said from the doorway, still in her suit from the boardroom, watching him with the kind of peace most billionaires never find. He looked up, that devastating smile that had nothing to do with wanting anything from her. "Your chef makes food for clients. I make food for my wife." That was Wesley. He had this gift for making her billion-dollar world feel small enough to hold in two hands, for turning a penthouse into a home instead of a tax write-off. When Brenda had first encountered him at a gallery opening, he'd been wearing a suit that probably cost what she spent on coffee. But he hadn't known who she was, and when she'd mentioned her company's name, he'd simply asked what she actually did there. Not what it was worth. Not how many people she employed. What did she do that made her eyes light up? Their marriage had raised eyebrows at every level. Her board had used the phrase liability assessment 9 times in one emergency meeting. Her father had suggested she was confusing love with loneliness. But Brenda had never been more certain of anything in her calculated life. Until the morning, Marcus Chen walked into her office with a manila folder that would burn her world down. Marcus was her head of security, a man whose paranoia she paid 7 figures a year to maintain. He placed the folder on her desk like it contained a live grenade. "I need you to see this before the board does." The first photograph showed Wesley in a cafe she didn't recognize, leaning close to a woman Brenda knew too well. Vivian Cross, CEO of their largest competitor. The woman who had been trying to acquire Anderson Industries for 3 years. The second photo showed Wesley's laptop screen, clearly visible, displaying what looked like proprietary code from Brenda's newest project. The third showed him handing Vivian a flash drive. "These were taken over the last 2 weeks," Marcus said quietly. "The metadata checks out." The encryption analyst confirmed those are your development files on his screen. Brenda's hands didn't shake. They never did, but something behind her sternum cracked like ice over deep water. "Where is he now?" "On his way home, I assume. Mrs. Anderson, I've already contacted legal. Given the intellectual property at stake, get out." She sat alone in her office for an hour. The photographs spread before her like tarot cards reading a future she refused to accept. Every business instinct she possessed screamed the same verdict. The evidence was irrefutable. The betrayal was calculated. She'd been a fool. When Wesley came home that evening, she was waiting in their living room, the folder on the glass coffee table between them like a divorce petition that hadn't been filed yet. "Brenda?" He stopped in the doorway, reading something in her posture that made his smile die. "What's wrong?" She slid the folder across the table, watched his face as he opened it, watched confusion bloom into horror. "This isn't... Brenda, I don't even know who this woman is." "Vivian Cross, CEO of Cross Technologies, your new employer, apparently." "I have never met this person." His voice cracked with something that sounded remarkably like genuine panic. "These photos are fake, or someone set this up. But I swear to God, don't." The word came out like a blade. "Don't insult me by lying. The metadata is authenticated. The encryption signatures match. You gave her our proprietary code." "I would never." "You already did." She stood, and she hated how her body felt like it belonged to someone else. "I want you out, tonight." "Brenda, please, just let me explain." "There's nothing to explain. I built this company from nothing, and I won't let anyone destroy it. Not even you." The words that came next from Wesley were desperate, broken, but Brenda had already turned to stone. She'd survived hostile takeovers and market crashes by trusting her instincts. This was no different. By midnight, Wesley Castillo was gone, taking only what he'd brought into the marriage. By morning, divorce papers were filed. By the end of the week, Brenda's lawyers had ensured he signed away any claim to her fortune, her company, her life. She told herself it was protection. She told herself it was strength. She never told herself it was a mistake she'd spent 15 years paying for. 3 weeks after Wesley signed the divorce papers, Brenda Anderson stood alone in her marble bathroom at 2 in the morning, staring at a pregnancy test that would rewrite her entire future. The plus sign seemed to pulse in the dim light, mocking every decision she'd made. Her hand moved instinctively to her stomach, still flat, still holding a secret that felt like both a miracle and a curse. Wesley's child, the traitor's child, the only man she'd ever loved, had betrayed her empire. And now she carried the evidence of her weakness inside her own body. Some would say what she did next was protection. Others would call it the cruelest decision a mother could make. She told no one, not her board, not her father, not even Marcus Chen. The morning sickness she hid behind closed office doors and blamed on stress. The growing curve of her belly she disguised behind custom-tailored suits and strategic board meeting cancellations. By her 5th month, she'd stopped appearing in public altogether, citing a sabbatical to focus on corporate restructuring. The truth was far more isolating than anyone imagined. When the ultrasound technician, sworn to an ironclad NDA worth more than most people's mortgages, told her there were 2 heartbeats, Brenda felt something crack open in her chest that she couldn't afford to feel. Twins. She was going to have twins. 2 boys who would carry Wesley's eyes, his smile, his devastating kindness that she'd mistaken for deception. "Ms. Anderson," the technician's voice pulled her back. "Would you like to know the—" "No names on any documents," Brenda interrupted, her voice the same steel she used in hostile acquisitions. "No records that can be traced. You understand the agreement." The woman nodded, and Brenda hated herself a little more. By her 8th month, Anderson Estate had transformed into something between a fortress and a prison. She'd purchased the property years ago, a sprawling compound in the hills outside the city, surrounded by gates and security that would make government facilities jealous. Now it became the only world her sons would know. The night they were born, during a lightning storm that knocked out power across 3 counties, Brenda's private medical team delivered 2 perfect screaming boys in a bedroom that had been converted into a sterile delivery suite. She held them both, one in each arm, their tiny faces so heartbreakingly similar to Wesley's that she had to close her eyes against the grief. "What will you name them?" the midwife asked gently. Brenda looked down at her sons, these innocent casualties of her pride and his betrayal. "Ethan," she said, touching the firstborn's cheek, "and Adrian." Strong names, names that belonged to boys who would grow up powerful, protected, and completely hidden from the man who'd fathered them. What she didn't know, as she made that choice in the aftermath of exhaustion and pain, was that Wesley had spent every day since the divorce trying to prove his innocence. That he'd hired forensic analysts who confirmed the photos were digitally manipulated. That he'd tracked the fake metadata back to a source inside Cross Technologies. That every attempt to contact her had been intercepted by the same security chief who'd brought her the fabricated evidence in the first place. The question everyone would ask later was simple. If Brenda Anderson could afford the best investigators in the world, why didn't she ever look for the truth? The years that followed fell into a pattern that might have looked like paradise from the outside. The estate became a kingdom of 3, carefully curated and completely isolated. Brenda transformed the East Wing into a private school, hiring tutors who signed contracts that made government clearances look casual. The twins had everything money could provide. Olympic-sized pool, private movie theater, stables with horses they named after constellations, a library that would shame most universities. What they didn't have was the outside world. No friends their own age, no birthday parties with other children, no father. On their 5th birthday, Ethan asked the question Brenda had been dreading. "Mama, why don't we have a daddy like the people in our books?" She'd knelt between them in their playroom, surrounded by toys that cost more than most cars, and constructed a lie she'd spend the next decade maintaining. "Your father was someone I loved very much, but he made choices that hurt our family. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes that can't be fixed. Do you understand?" Adrian, always the more perceptive twin, had touched her face where a tear had escaped. "Did he hurt you, Mama?" "Yes, sweetheart, he did." The worst part was, it wasn't entirely a lie. Wesley had hurt her, even if the betrayal had been fabricated. The pain was real. Even if its source was false. By the twins' 10th birthday, the estate had become something else entirely. The gates that were meant to keep the world out had also locked them in. Brenda watched her sons grow brilliant and isolated, their world shrinking even as her empire expanded. She told herself it was safety. She told herself it was love. She told herself that the hollow feeling in her chest every time they asked about their father was just the price of protecting what mattered most. But late at night, alone in the bedroom she'd once shared with Wesley, Brenda sometimes pulled up the hidden folder on her computer. The one containing the private investigation she'd commissioned 6 months after the divorce. The one that proved, with devastating clarity, that every piece of evidence against Wesley had been manufactured. That Marcus Chen had been on Cross Technologies' payroll for 2 years before the discovery. That the entire betrayal had been orchestrated by Vivian Cross herself. She'd known the truth for almost 15 years. She'd kept it buried for almost 15 years. And the boys who slept peacefully in the East Wing had no idea their entire childhood was built on a lie their mother was too proud to correct. What would you do if admitting the truth meant destroying everything you'd built to protect it? Wesley Castillo had built a comfortable life in the 15 years since Brenda Anderson destroyed him. But comfort and peace were not the same thing, and he'd learned that distinction in ways that hollowed him out from the inside. The penthouse he purchased after the divorce was everything hers hadn't been. Modest by billionaire standards, tucked away in a building where neighbors didn't ask questions and doormen were paid enough to forget faces. He'd taken the settlement she'd offered, not because he wanted her money, but because fighting it would have required a public battle he no longer had the heart for. Some say a truly innocent man would have fought harder. Others argue that sometimes the system breaks you before you can prove it wrong. What would you do if the person you loved most refused to hear your truth? The accusations had done their work. Even without criminal charges, the whisper of corporate espionage had followed him like a shadow he couldn't outrun. Gallery openings went quiet when he entered. Business opportunities evaporated with polite excuses. The life he'd built beside Brenda had been replaced by something that looked successful from the outside, but felt like exile. But what haunted Wesley most wasn't the lost reputation. It was the lost chance to explain. In the first year after the divorce, Wesley had burned through 3 law firms and $250,000 trying to prove the photos were fake. He'd hired forensic analysts who confirmed digital manipulation. He'd tracked the metadata inconsistencies back to their source. A contractor who'd worked for Cross Technologies and disappeared to the Cayman Islands 3 days after the evidence surfaced, his bank account suddenly 7 figures heavier. Every piece of proof he gathered hit the same wall. Brenda Anderson wouldn't see him, wouldn't take his calls. Had instructed her legal team that any contact would be considered harassment. The question that plagued him for 15 years was simple. How could the woman who'd known him so intimately believe he was capable of such betrayal? Marcus Chen, the head of security who'd delivered the fabricated files, had vanished from Anderson Industries 6 months after the divorce with a severance package that screamed hush money. Wesley had tried to track him down, hired investigators who traced him to Singapore, then lost the trail entirely. Whatever Marcus knew died with his disappearance. By the 2nd year, Wesley stopped trying. What was the point of proving your innocence to someone who'd already decided you were guilty? But giving up on justice and giving up on love were two different surrenders, and Wesley learned he was capable of one, but not the other. He lived quietly after that, invested the settlement wisely, enough to maintain the lifestyle of a man who'd once married a billionaire but never needed her fortune. His businesses grew, carefully chosen investments in sustainable technology and medical research, fields Brenda had always dismissed as too slow burn for her aggressive portfolio. The irony wasn't lost on him that the companies he built followed his values, not hers. By his 40th birthday, Wesley's portfolio had grown to $50 million. He could have bought back into the circles that had cast him out, could have forced society to acknowledge that the accused corporate spy was now running 3 successful companies. Instead, he lived like a ghost in his own life, wealthy but invisible. On their anniversary each year, the date that should have been a celebration, Wesley stood on his balcony watching the city lights and wondered if Brenda ever thought of him. He dated over the years intelligent women, beautiful women, women who looked at him like he was a mystery they wanted to solve. But none of them had Brenda's fire. None of them made a penthouse feel like home instead of a monument to what he'd lost. What he didn't know was that 200 miles away, in a fortified estate he'd never heard of, 2 15-year-old boys with his eyes and her determination were asking their mother questions she couldn't answer honestly. The whispers he'd heard about Brenda over the years painted a strange picture. She'd retreated from public life almost completely after the divorce. Anderson Industries thrived, but its CEO had become a phantom, conducting business through video calls and proxy votes. Some speculated health issues. Others suggested she'd simply grown tired of the spotlight. Wesley wondered sometimes, in moments of weakness he'd never admit to anyone, if maybe she felt even a fraction of the hollow ache he carried. If her retreat meant guilt. If her silence meant regret. But wondering was all he had left, and even that was about to be taken from him. The first symptom appeared on a Tuesday morning, 6 months before the call that would change everything. Wesley woke up exhausted, despite sleeping 10 hours. Blamed it on stress, on age, creeping past 40, on the emptiness of waking up alone in a king-sized bed. The second symptom was swelling in his ankles that wouldn't go down. The third was pain in his lower back that felt like someone had driven nails into his spine. He ignored all of it for 3 months. Successful men don't have time for doctor's appointments. Lonely men don't want to hear they're falling apart. By the time he finally walked into Dr. Sarah Martinez's office, the disease had already made itself at home in his body, quiet and efficient and absolutely fatal without intervention. "Mr. Castillo," Dr. Martinez said, her face carrying the expression doctors learn when they have to deliver news that will rewrite someone's future. "Your kidney function is at 18%. You have acute renal failure, likely genetic in origin, and without a transplant, you have approximately 18 months. Wesley sat in the leather chair across from her desk. Expensive suit, successful portfolio, $50 million in assets, and none of it meant a damn thing against the words 18 months. "What are my options?" His voice sounded calmer than he felt. "Dialysis will buy you time, but quality of life deteriorates rapidly. A transplant is your best chance, but—" She hesitated in a way that made his stomach drop. "Your genetic markers are extremely rare. The National Registry has no matches. Finding a donor will be difficult, potentially impossible." Some would say what Wesley did next was desperate. Others would call it the bravest thing a man could do. He was about to reach out to the woman who'd vowed never to speak to him again. And in doing so, he would set in motion a chain of revelations that would expose secrets neither of them was prepared to face. But he didn't know that yet. Sitting in that doctor's office, all Wesley Castillo knew was that he was dying, and the only person with the resources and connections to help him was the woman who'd spent 15 years believing he'd betrayed her. What he couldn't possibly know was that the help he needed would come from two sons he never knew existed. That Brenda Anderson had spent 15 years hiding the biggest secret of her life. That the phone call he was about to make would shatter the gilded cage she'd built and force both of them to face the truth they'd been running from. The question was, would that truth save him or destroy what little they had left? Subscribe if you believe innocent people wrongly accused deserve justice, even years later. Only those who think being destroyed by lies is just bad luck won't hit that subscribe button. The phone sat on Wesley's kitchen counter for 3 days before he finally picked it up. 3 days of staring at the number he'd kept saved all these years under a contact labeled simply B. 3 days of rehearsing and discarding opening lines that all sounded equally pathetic. 3 days of pride warring with survival, and survival was finally winning by a narrow, desperate margin. Dr. Martinez had been blunt in their follow-up appointment. You have 4 viable options for donor matches, Mr. Castillo. Family members are your best bet, but you've indicated you have no siblings, and your parents are deceased. That leaves the National Registry, which has yielded nothing. International registries, which are showing the same results. Or what? There's a private research program at Morrison Medical Institute. They specialize in genetic matching for rare cases like yours. But the waiting list is 2 years long, and frankly, you don't have 2 years. Getting in requires either a medical miracle or connections most people don't have. Wesley had left that appointment knowing exactly one person with the kind of connections that could move mountains. The same person who'd spent 15 years pretending he didn't exist. Some would call what he was about to do manipulative. Others would say a dying man has the right to ask for help from anyone, even the woman who destroyed him. What would you do if your only chance at survival meant begging the person who hurt you most? His finger hovered over the call button for a full minute before he pressed it. The phone rang once, twice. On the third ring, he almost hung up, almost chose pride over survival one more time. Then her voice filled his ear, professional and cautious, and achingly familiar. This is Brenda Anderson. 15 years collapsed into that moment. 15 years of silence, of unanswered questions, of a love that had died in a conference room over fabricated evidence. Wesley's throat closed around words that suddenly felt impossible to speak. Hello? If this is a solicitation call, Brenda. His voice cracked on her name. It's Wesley. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 5 seconds, but felt like drowning. He heard her breath catch, heard what might have been her hand tightening on the phone. How did you get this number? Her voice had gone cold, the warmth he'd heard in the greeting vanishing like frost over glass. I never deleted it. He closed his eyes, gripping his kitchen counter with his free hand. Brenda, I need to talk to you. It's important. We have nothing to discuss. My lawyers made that very clear 15 years ago. I'm dying. The words hung in the air between them, brutal and simple. He heard her sharp intake of breath, then nothing. Just the hum of the connection and the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. What? Her voice had changed, softened almost imperceptibly. Kidney failure, genetic, rare markers that make finding a donor almost impossible. The medical terms felt easier than the emotional ones. I have maybe 18 months without a transplant. Less if I'm unlucky. I'm sorry to hear that, Wesley, but I don't understand why you're calling me. There it was. The moment where he had to strip away the last shred of pride he'd been clinging to for 15 years. Morrison Medical Institute has a program, specialized genetic matching for cases like mine. It's my only real chance, but the waiting list is 2 years long, and I don't have 2 years. He swallowed hard. You have connections, I don't. Board members, research directors, people who owe you favors. I'm not asking for money. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking you to make a phone call that might save my life. The silence stretched so long he thought she'd hung up. You're asking me to help you. Her voice was strange, hollow. After everything that happened, you're asking me for help. I know I have no right. I know you think I betrayed you. But Brenda, I swear on everything I have left, I never did what you accused me of. Those files were fake. The photos were manufactured. And I'm begging you, not as your ex-husband, but as a human being who doesn't want to die, please just make the call. He heard something that might have been a sob or might have been a sharp exhale. I need to think about this. I don't have time for you to think. The desperation in his voice surprised even him. Every day I wait, my kidney function drops. Every week on dialysis is a week I'll never get back. Please, Brenda. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to save my life. What Wesley didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that on the other end of the line, Brenda Anderson was standing in her home office with her hand pressed to her mouth, staring at a photograph on her desk. A photograph of 2 15-year-old boys with green eyes exactly like his. I'll call you back in 24 hours, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Brenda, wait. The line went dead. Wesley set the phone down with shaking hands and wondered if he'd just made the call that would save him or the one that would break him all over again. He had no way of knowing that Brenda was already moving through her house like a woman possessed, pulling files from locked drawers, medical records from hidden safes, genetic test results she'd run years ago on her sons just to know their blood types. He couldn't know that the help he'd asked for would come with a price neither of them had anticipated. That the answer to his genetic mystery was sleeping peacefully in the east wing of a fortified estate, dreaming dreams that had nothing to do with the father they'd never met. The question haunting both of them now was simple and terrifying. How do you tell a dying man he has sons? How do you ask those sons to save the father you stole from them? And once the truth comes out, can any of them survive it? Brenda didn't sleep the night after Wesley's call. She sat in her home office until 3 in the morning, staring at her phone like it was a live grenade, replaying his voice in her mind. I'm dying. Those 2 words had detonated something inside her chest that 15 years of careful isolation hadn't fully buried. Some would say what she did next was compassion. Others would call it guilt, finally catching up with her. The truth, as always, lived somewhere in the complicated space between. By 6 a.m. she'd made 4 calls, the first to her head of private security, requesting a complete medical file on Wesley Castillo. The second to her personal physician, Dr. Raymond Chen, requesting a discreet consultation. The third to the director of Morrison Medical Institute, a woman who sat on 2 of Brenda's nonprofit boards and owed her considerably more than one favor. The fourth call she didn't make, though her finger hovered over Marcus Chen's last known number for 10 full minutes before she set the phone down. The medical file arrived by encrypted courier at noon. Brenda opened it alone in her office, doors locked, security cameras temporarily disabled. Old habits from 15 years of keeping secrets. The file was thicker than she'd expected. Detailed blood work, genetic panels, specialist consultations that painted a picture of a man whose body was systematically shutting down. But it was page 17 that made her hands start shaking. Genetic marker analysis. Patient presents with extremely rare HLA typing. Combination of A3201, B4403, DR0701 occurs in approximately 1 in 847,000 individuals of mixed European Latin American descent. National and international registry searches, 0 matches identified. Recommendation: family donor screening essential. Without genetic relative, transplant probability drops to less than 3%. Family donor screening. The words seemed to pulse on the page. Brenda set the file down and walked to the window overlooking the estate grounds. Below, she could see Ethan and Adrian on the tennis court, their movements so synchronized they might have been mirror images. 15 years old, brilliant, isolated, and carrying genetic markers she'd never thought to investigate beyond basic health screening. What she was thinking was impossible. Insane. The odds alone made it laughable. But what if? The question haunted her through lunch, through a conference call she barely participated in, through the afternoon hours that felt like wading through concrete. By 4 p.m., she'd made a decision that would either save Wesley's life or destroy what remained of her carefully constructed world. Dr. Raymond Chen arrived at the estate at 7 p.m., carrying a discreet medical kit, and the kind of professional silence Brenda paid him 6 figures a year to maintain. "I need genetic panels run on my sons," she said without preamble. "Full HLA typing. Comparison against this profile." She handed him Wesley's genetic marker analysis, watching his eyes widen as he scanned the details. "Ms. Anderson, these are extremely rare markers. If you're looking for a match, the statistical probability—" "I understand the statistics, Raymond. Just run the tests." "May I ask why you suspect a connection?" Brenda looked at him with the expression that had closed billion-dollar deals and silenced hostile boards. "You may not." The twins were easy to convince. "Just a routine health screening," she told them over dinner, her voice steady despite the lie sitting heavy on her tongue. "You're both 15 now. It's standard procedure." Adrian, always the more suspicious twin, narrowed his eyes. "You've never cared about standard procedure before." "Well, caring now. Humor your paranoid mother." Ethan laughed, nudging his brother. "Come on, it's just a blood draw." "What's the worst that could happen?" What's the worst that could happen? If only they knew the answer to that question was about to rewrite all their lives. Dr. Chen drew the blood samples in the estate's private medical suite, professional and efficient. The twins joked through the procedure, making bets about who would get their results back faster, completely unaware that their mother was standing behind the observation glass with her arms wrapped around herself, holding her breath, like a woman waiting for a verdict. "Results in 48 hours, Dr. Chen said as he packed up his kit. "But Ms. Anderson, I feel obligated to point out that what you're hoping for is statistically almost impossible. The odds of your sons matching these specific rare markers—" "48 hours," Brenda interrupted. "Call me the second you know." He nodded and left, and Brenda stood alone in the medical suite, staring at the vials of blood labeled Subject A and Subject B, as if clinical distance could protect her from what she'd set in motion. The next 2 days were the longest of her life. She moved through board meetings like a ghost, signed documents she didn't read, responded to emails in words she didn't remember typing. Every time her phone buzzed, her heart stopped. Every notification that wasn't Dr. Chen felt like a reprieve and a torture. Some would say she should have told Wesley immediately. Others argue she had the right to know the truth before making promises she couldn't keep. What would you do if you suspected your hidden sons might be the only people who could save their father's life? The call came at 2 a.m. on the third night. Brenda was awake, of course, sitting in her darkened office with the medical file open on her desk. Wesley's genetic markers memorized like a poem she couldn't unlearn. "Ms. Anderson," Dr. Chen's voice was strange, careful. "I have the results." And the pause that followed felt like falling. I don't understand how this is possible, but both subjects are perfect matches. Not just compatible. Perfect. 6 antigen matches on both twins. The statistical probability of this occurring in non-related individuals is essentially 0, which means… Brenda hung up. She sat in the darkness, phone still in her hand, while the truth she'd been running from for 15 years finally caught up with her. Perfect matches. Both of them. Because of course they were. Because they were Wesley's sons. Carrying his rare genetic markers in their blood. Walking proof of the 15-year lie she'd built their entire childhood on. The man she'd thrown out. The man she'd accused of betrayal. The man who was dying 200 miles away. Had no idea he'd fathered twins. Had no idea that the only 2 people in the world who could save his life were the sons she'd hidden from him out of pride and fear, and a truth she'd learned too late to matter. But here was the horrifying question that kept Brenda frozen in her chair until dawn broke over the estate. How do you tell your sons their father is alive? How do you explain you've lied to them every single day of their lives? How do you ask 2 15-year-old boys to undergo dangerous surgery to save a man you taught them to believe abandoned their mother? And the question that terrified her most of all, what happens when Wesley discovers not just that he has sons, but that she's known the truth of his innocence for almost 15 years and never told him? The phone buzzed again, Wesley's name on the screen. She'd promised to call him back in 24 hours. That deadline had passed 2 days ago. Brenda stared at the phone, at the choice that wasn't really a choice at all. She could stay silent and let Wesley die, taking her secret to whatever grave her conscience would allow. Or she could tell the truth and watch her carefully constructed world collapse around the people she'd claimed to protect. Some lies are too big to keep. And some truths are too devastating to tell. But she was about to discover that the cost of her silence would be paid in ways she'd never imagined. The call Brenda made to Wesley at dawn was the shortest conversation that would change 4 lives forever. "Come to this address, tomorrow at 2 p.m. Come alone." "Brenda, what?" "If you want to live, Wesley, you'll be there." She hung up before he could ask the questions she wasn't ready to answer, before her courage could fail, before the weight of what she was about to do could crush her completely. Some would say she waited too long to tell the truth. Others might argue she was finally doing the right thing, even if it was 15 years late. But the question that haunted her as she prepared for Wesley's arrival was simpler and more terrifying. Would any of them survive what came next? The twins knew something was wrong the moment they saw the security gates open for an unfamiliar car. In 15 years, No one outside their carefully vetted circle had ever been allowed past the outer perimeter. Ethan and Adrian stood at the east wing window, watching a modest sedan make its way up the long driveway. "Mama?" Adrian's voice carried the edge it always did when he sensed deception. "Who's coming?" Brenda stood in the foyer, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She'd rehearsed this moment 100 times in the sleepless hours since Dr. Chen's call. None of those rehearsals had prepared her for the reality of watching Wesley's car pull up to the estate that had been her fortress against him. "Someone we need to talk about," she said quietly. "Both of you, come downstairs. Now." The twins exchanged glances that spoke in the silent language of brothers who'd only ever had each other. They descended the curved staircase together, identical in their wariness, and Brenda saw Wesley in every angle of their faces. The doorbell rang, such an ordinary sound to announce the end of everything. Brenda opened the door herself, dismissing the staff with a gesture. Wesley stood on her threshold looking thinner than she remembered, his face carrying the kind of exhaustion that came from dying by degrees. But his eyes, those green eyes she'd spent 15 years trying to forget, were exactly the same. "Brenda," his voice was careful, uncertain. "What is this about?" She stepped aside without answering, letting him into the marble foyer that could have held his entire penthouse twice over. His gaze swept the space, taking in the wealth she'd wrapped around herself like armor, then landed on the two boys standing frozen at the base of the stairs. The moment stretched and shattered. Wesley's face went white. His hand reached for the doorframe like a man whose legs had forgotten how to hold him. He stared at Ethan and Adrian, at their green eyes that mirrored his own, at their faces that carried echoes of both their parents, at the impossible truth standing 15 feet away in matching expressions of confusion. "Brenda," his voice broke on her name. "What did you do?" "Mama, who is this?" Ethan asked, but his brother had already figured it out. Adrian's face had gone very still, the way it did when he was processing something that would hurt. This is Wesley Castillo," Brenda said, and her voice sounded like someone else's, calm, steady, absolutely destroyed. "He was my husband 15 years ago. And he's your father." The silence that followed felt like the world ending in slow motion. Wesley made a sound that wasn't quite a word, his hand pressed to his chest like he was trying to keep his heart from breaking through his ribs. I have sons?" He looked at Brenda with something that went beyond betrayal into territory there weren't words for. "I have sons, and you never told me." "You left us," Adrian said suddenly, his voice cold in a way that made Brenda flinch. "Mama said you made choices that hurt our family." "I never left anyone." Wesley's shout echoed through the foyer, raw and anguished. "I never knew you existed. I was thrown out based on lies, and your mother never gave me a chance to—" He stopped, his breathing ragged, eyes wild as he turned back to Brenda. "How long have you known?" "Known what?" Ethan's voice was smaller now, younger, the voice of a boy watching his world collapse. "That I was innocent." Wesley's gaze never left Brenda's face. "That's why I'm here, isn't it? That's why you called me to this fortress, because you know the truth now, and you need something from me." "It's not like that," Brenda started, but the words felt hollow even to her. "Then what is it like? Explain to me how I have 15-year-old sons I never knew existed. Explain to me why you hid them like secrets when I spent 15 years alone. grieving the only family I ever wanted. The twins stood frozen, watching their parents destroy each other in front of them, and Brenda saw the moment they began to understand that everything they'd been told about their childhood was built on lies. "You're dying," she said quietly. "Kidney failure, rare genetic markers, no donor matches." Wesley's face shifted, understanding beginning to dawn with horrifying clarity. "Your sons," Brenda continued, each word feeling like pulling out her own teeth, "are perfect matches. Both of them. They're the only people in the world who can save your life." The revelation hit like a physical blow. Wesley looked at the twins, at these boys who carried his genetics, his features, his blood, and Brenda watched him understand the full, devastating scope of what she'd done. "You hid my sons from me for 15 years, he said slowly, his voice dangerously quiet. "And now you're telling me they're the only thing standing between me and death. That the children you stole from me are my only chance at survival." "We can save him?" Ethan's voice cracked. "We can actually save him? It's dangerous," Brenda said. "Kidney donation always carries risks, especially for donors as young as you. And—" "Did you know?" Adrian interrupted, looking at his mother with eyes too old for 15. "When you divorced him, when you kicked him out, did you know you were pregnant?" The question hung in the air like an executioner's blade. "No," Brenda whispered. "I didn't know until after." "But you found out eventually that he was innocent." Wesley's voice was hollow now, all the anger burned out into ash. "Didn't you?" The silence was answer enough. "Oh my God!" He actually laughed, a broken sound that hurt to hear. You knew I was innocent, and you still kept them from me. For how long, Brenda? How many years have you known the truth?" She couldn't answer, couldn't force the words past the guilt crushing her chest. "How long?" 14 years, she whispered. The number landed like a bomb. Wesley staggered, actually physically staggered, and Ethan moved instinctively toward him before catching himself, torn between the father he'd just discovered and the mother who'd raised him on lies. What happened next would determine whether this fractured family could find any path forward, or whether the truth Brenda had finally unleashed would destroy them all beyond repair. The question facing all four of them was terrifying in its simplicity. Can you forgive the unforgivable? Can you save the life of someone who stole yours? And once the truth is finally spoken, is there any way back from the damage it's done? The answer, they were about to discover, would cost them everything they thought they knew about love, loyalty, and what family actually means. Subscribe if you believe a father has the right to know his children exist, no matter how much time has passed. Only those who think some secrets should stay buried forever won't hit that button. The four of them sat in Brenda's vast living room like strangers at a funeral, the weight of 15 years of lies pressing down until the air felt too thin to breathe. Wesley had refused to sit at first, pacing the marble floors like a caged animal, his hands shaking with rage or grief or both. The twins perched on the edge of a leather sofa that probably cost more than most cars, watching this man who was suddenly their father fall apart in real time. Brenda stood by the window, her back to all of them, unable to face what she'd created. Some would say she deserved every second of this torment. Others might argue that carrying the guilt alone for 14 years was punishment enough. What would you do if your lie finally caught up with you in the worst possible way? "I need to understand," Ethan said finally, his voice cutting through the terrible silence. "You're saying Mama threw you out because she thought you betrayed her company. But you didn't actually do it. No, Wesley said, stopping his pacing to look at his son, really look at him for the first time. I loved your mother. I would have died before betraying her. Someone manufactured evidence to destroy us, and it worked perfectly. Then why didn't you fight harder? Adrian's question came out sharp, accusatory, the anger of 15 years of half-truths crystallizing into something dangerous. The words hit Wesley like a physical blow. Give up? I spent 2 years trying to prove my innocence. 2 years of lawyers and investigators and evidence that your mother refused to even look at. How do you fight someone who won't let you in the room to defend yourself? But what Wesley didn't know yet was that the evidence he'd gathered 15 years ago was sitting in a locked drawer in Brenda's office, along with the private investigation that had confirmed his innocence. She'd known where to find him all along. She'd known everything. You could have tried harder, Adrian insisted, but his voice wavered now, the anger cracking to reveal something more vulnerable underneath. You could have found a way. I tried everything I had. Wesley's voice broke, raw and honest, in a way that made both twins lean forward unconsciously. And when nothing worked, when every door slammed in my face, when even my own wife believed a lie over 15 years of knowing who I really was, I had to accept that sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes the person you love most is the one who destroys you, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. The question hanging in the room was brutal in its simplicity. Can you forgive someone who believed the worst of you when they should have known better? I didn't know I was pregnant when he left, Brenda said quietly, still facing the window like a coward. That part was true. I found out 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized. 3 weeks after I'd already destroyed everything. But you knew he was innocent, Ethan said, and it wasn't a question anymore. It was an accusation that landed like a verdict. For 14 years, you knew the truth, and you never told him. You never told us. You just let him think he'd lost everything, while you raised us on lies. Yes. The single word carried the weight of a confession that couldn't be taken back. Brenda finally turned to face them, and the twins had never seen their mother look so small, so utterly broken. The woman who'd built an empire, who'd raised them in isolated luxury, who'd never shown weakness, was crying like her heart was being ripped out in pieces. I was wrong, she whispered. I was proud and suspicious, and when I finally learned the truth, I was too ashamed to admit what I'd done. So I told myself I was protecting you, that Wesley had moved on, that he was better off without the reminder of what I'd done to him, that bringing him back would only hurt everyone more. She paused, and the twins watched their mother strip away every defense she'd ever had. But the truth is, I was protecting myself, from having to face what I'd destroyed, from having to admit that my pride cost all of us 15 years we'll never get back, from having to look at the man I loved and tell him I'd known he was innocent almost from the beginning and still chose to keep his children from him. Wesley sank into a chair like his legs had finally given out completely. You stole 15 years from me. 15 years of watching them grow up. First words, first steps, first day of school, first everything. You took my entire family and hid it away in this fortress like a secret you were ashamed of, and I can never get that back. Never. I know, Brenda whispered. And I will spend the rest of my life living with that. Knowing doesn't fix it. The shout echoed through the room like breaking glass. Knowing doesn't give me back birthdays and bedtime stories and teaching them to ride bikes. It doesn't give me back being a father. The twins sat frozen between their parents' pain, watching two people who'd once loved each other enough to build a life together now destroy whatever fragments were left. But it was what came next that would define all four of them. "We want to do it," Ethan said suddenly, his voice cutting through the emotional wreckage. Everyone turned to stare at him. "Do what?" Brenda asked, though the hope and fear in her voice said she already knew. "The donation, the kidney transplant. Whatever it takes to save him." Ethan looked at his brother. Some silent communication passing between them in the language only twins speak. "Right?" Adrian's jaw was tight, his eyes still hard with anger and confusion, and a hurt so deep it seemed to radiate from him. But he nodded slowly, deliberately. "He's our father. Whether we knew him or not, whether he was there or not, he's our father. And he's dying because of something that wasn't his fault. Something that was done to him. How can we not help?" "No," Wesley said immediately, lurching to his feet. "Absolutely not. You're 15 years old. You're children. I won't let you risk your lives for mine, especially not when I just found out you exist." "It's not your choice," Adrian shot back, and there was steel in his voice that sounded exactly like Brenda's. "It's ours, our bodies, our decision. You don't understand what you're offering." Wesley's desperation filled the room. "Kidney donation is serious surgery. There are risks, complications, infections, things that could affect you for the rest of your lives. You could die on that table, and I would have to live knowing my sons sacrificed themselves for a father they'd known for 3 days. Some would call what the twins were offering heroic. Others would say they were too young to understand the magnitude of what they were choosing. Where do you stand? Can children this young truly consent to risk their lives, even for their father? Let me know in the comments. "We know the risks," Ethan said calmly. "Mama already had Dr. Chen explain everything to us. 20% chance of minor complications, 5% chance of serious complications, 0.3% chance of mortality, longer recovery time because we're young and still growing, possible impact on future health. We understand the math, and we understand what we're choosing." Wesley looked at Brenda with something close to horror, mixed with desperate hope. "You already briefed them? Before even telling me they existed? Before this conversation even happened? You were planning to use them as donors?" "I was trying to save your life," she said. But even she heard how hollow the words sounded. "By asking our sons to cut themselves open for a father they've never met? By putting them in surgical danger to fix the catastrophic mess you created 15 years ago?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke. "He's right," Adrian said quietly, and everyone turned to him in surprise. "This is completely messed up, all of it. You lied to us for 15 years. You stole our father from us based on evidence you later knew was fake. You kept us locked in this estate like prisoners you were protecting from a threat that didn't exist. And now you want us to risk surgery to save him. It's manipulative and calculated, and exactly the kind of ruthless thing you'd do to close a business deal you couldn't afford to lose." Brenda flinched like each word was a physical blow. "But here's the thing," Adrian continued, his voice steadier now, carrying a conviction that seemed to surprise even him. "We're not doing this for you. We're doing it for him, and for us. Because whatever happened in the past, whatever lies were told, or hearts were broken, or years were stolen, he's our father. We just found him. And we're not losing him 3 weeks later because we were too afraid to help." Ethan nodded, reaching over to grip his brother's hand in a gesture so automatic it spoke of 15 years of having only each other. "We've spent our whole lives in this estate, isolated and protected, and wrapped in so much cotton wool we could barely breathe. Every decision made for us, every risk eliminated, every choice taken away because Mama thought she knew better. Maybe this is the first real choice we've ever gotten to make for ourselves. And we're choosing to save our father." The silence that followed felt different somehow. Still heavy, still weighted with pain and betrayal and damage that couldn't be undone, but carrying something underneath that might have been hope if you looked at it from the right angle. Wesley looked at his sons. These boys he'd never known existed, offering to sacrifice pieces of their own bodies to keep a stranger alive. He saw Brenda's determination in their eyes, his own features in their faces, and something that belonged to neither parent in their fierce, frightening courage. "You're absolutely sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You truly understand what you're offering? This isn't a small thing. This is surgery, recovery, scars you'll carry for the rest of your lives." "We're sure," they said in perfect unison, and Wesley wondered if they'd always been this synchronized, if growing up as twins in total isolation had made them into two halves of one whole, incomplete without each other. But what none of them knew yet, what couldn't be seen in this moment of fragile decision, was that the choice the twins were making would save more than just Wesley's life. It would crack open secrets that Brenda had buried even deeper than her knowledge of Wesley's innocence. And when those secrets came to light in 5 days, the tentative truce they were building would be tested in ways that would either forge them into a family or destroy them completely. "Then we do this," Wesley said finally, his voice shaking. "But I need you both to know something first. I would have given anything to be your father. Anything. If I had known you existed, nothing on this earth could have kept me away. Not your mother's anger, not lawyers, not restraining orders, nothing. The fact that I wasn't there wasn't choice. It was theft. And I will spend whatever time I have left trying to make up for the 15 years that were stolen from all of us." The twins nodded, and something passed between the three of them that Brenda could only watch from the outside, a connection forming in real time that she had no part in building. The medical team was assembled within 48 hours, the best transplant surgeons money could buy operating out of the estate's private medical wing. The surgery was scheduled for the following week, giving the twins time to undergo additional testing and Wesley time to stabilize his failing kidney function enough to survive the procedure. And in those 5 days between decision and surgery, 4 people who should have been a family tried to figure out how to exist in the same space when the foundation of trust had been shattered so completely that every interaction felt like walking on broken glass. Wesley moved into one of the guest suites, refusing Brenda's offer of the master wing with a look that could have cut steel. The twins orbited between them, drawn to their father's stories of the life he'd built after the divorce, wary of their mother's attempts at explanation. Meals were tense, silent affairs. Conversations died in awkward pauses. The estate that had been Brenda's fortress became a prison where 4 people served time for crimes they were only beginning to understand. But what Wesley didn't know, what he wouldn't discover until the surgery was over and he was recovering in the medical wing, was that Brenda's laptop sat in her office with a password-protected folder labeled Evidence 2010. A folder containing emails she'd written to Wesley 15 years ago, confessing everything, begging forgiveness, explaining the blackmail and manipulation that had kept her silent. Emails she'd never sent. Emails that proved her deception went even deeper than anyone suspected. And when Wesley found those emails, when he understood the full scope of what Brenda had known, and when she'd known it, the question facing them all wouldn't be whether they could forgive. It would be whether any amount of forgiveness could bridge a betrayal this complete. But that discovery was still days away. For now, they had a surgery to survive and a family to somehow build from the wreckage of all the lies that had brought them to this moment. The question that haunted all of them in those waiting days was simple and terrifying. Can you build a future on a foundation of broken trust? And if the twins save their father's life, will it be enough to save them all from the truth that's still waiting to destroy them? The surgery took 11 hours, and for every single minute, Brenda Anderson paced the private medical wing's waiting room like a woman being slowly torn apart from the inside. She'd watched them wheel her sons into the operating theater, one after the other, their faces pale but determined under the harsh fluorescent lights. Ethan had squeezed her hand and whispered, "We're doing the right thing." Adrian had simply nodded, his jaw set in that stubborn way that was pure Wesley. Then they were gone, disappearing behind surgical doors that felt like a judgment she couldn't appeal. Wesley had gone in last, his hand briefly touching hers as they passed in the hallway. Neither of them spoke. What words existed for this moment, where her sons were cutting pieces of themselves away to save the man she'd destroyed? Some would say the twins were heroes for their sacrifice. Others might argue they were victims of manipulation, too young to fully grasp what they'd agreed to. What do you think? Can a choice made under these circumstances ever truly be free? Let me know in the comments. By hour 6, Brenda had stopped counting the minutes. By hour 9, she'd stopped breathing normally. When Dr. Sarah Chen finally emerged at hour 11, still in surgical scrubs with exhaustion written across her face, Brenda actually stumbled getting to her feet. "They're all stable," Dr. Chen said, and Brenda felt something in her chest unlock. The transplant took perfectly. Adrian's kidney is functioning in Wesley's body like it was always meant to be there. Both twins came through without complications. Wesley's vitals are strong. Barring unforeseen issues, they should all make full recoveries. Brenda sat down hard, her legs simply giving out. And for the first time in 15 years, she let herself cry in front of someone other than her sons. Shaking sobs that felt like they were tearing her apart. Relief and guilt and grief all tangled together into something that had no name. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't see from that waiting room, was that her carefully buried secrets were about to claw their way to the surface in the worst possible way. Wesley woke up 3 days after the surgery in a private recovery suite that was nicer than most luxury hotels. The pain medication kept him floating in and out of consciousness, but even through the haze, he was aware of 2 things. He was alive, and his son's kidney was working inside him like a miracle he didn't deserve. The twins came to visit every day, wheeled in by nurses despite their own recovery, refusing to be separated from the father they'd just saved. They told him stories about growing up in the estate, about their tutors and their isolation, about the questions they'd asked about him that their mother could never quite answer honestly. Wesley listened and tried not to think about everything he'd missed. Every moment stolen by Brenda's pride and silence. Brenda herself only appeared twice, standing in the doorway like she wasn't sure she had permission to enter. Both times, Wesley pretended to be asleep. He wasn't ready to face her yet, wasn't sure he'd ever be ready to face the woman who'd known the truth for 14 years and kept his children from him anyway. By the end of the first week, Wesley was strong enough to sit up, to walk short distances with assistance, to occupy his mind with something other than pain and anger. That's when he noticed the laptop sitting on the desk in the corner, an older model that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. "Whose is that?" he asked the nurse during a routine check. She glanced over, unconcerned. "Ms. Anderson said you could use it if you needed to stay connected to your businesses during recovery. Said it's an old one from her office, already wiped and reset for guest use." But what the nurse didn't know, what Brenda had forgotten in her guilt and exhaustion, was that the laptop hadn't been wiped at all. It was the same one she'd used 15 years ago, the same one where she'd kept files she couldn't bear to delete, but couldn't afford to have discovered. Wesley opened the laptop that evening, intending to check his email, maybe read some news to keep his mind occupied. The desktop loaded slowly, and he was about to open the browser when he noticed a folder labeled Personal, Archive 2010. Something about the date made his stomach clench. 2010, the year of the divorce, the year his world ended. He shouldn't open it. He knew he shouldn't, but his hand was already moving the cursor, already clicking, already crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The folder was password protected. Of course it was. But Brenda had always used the same password for everything, a combination of her mother's maiden name and the year they'd met. He typed it in without thinking, muscle memory from a marriage that felt like another lifetime. The folder opened. Inside were dozens of files. Documents labeled Investigation Chen Marcus. PDFs titled Forensic Analysis, Photo Manipulation. And at the bottom, a subfolder that made his blood run cold. Unsent Wesley. His hand shook as he opened it. Inside were 43 emails, all addressed to him, all dated from late 2010 to early 2011. All never sent. He opened the first one, dated 6 months after the divorce, and the words on the screen felt like a knife sliding between his ribs. "Wesley, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to write it anyway. I was wrong. The investigation I commissioned came back today, and everything Marcus showed me was fabricated. The photos were digitally manipulated. The timestamps were falsified. The woman in the cafe wasn't even Vivian Cross. They used a look-alike model Marcus hired. You were telling the truth. You were innocent. And I destroyed us based on a lie I should have questioned from the beginning." Wesley couldn't breathe. His vision blurred, and he had to grip the edge of the laptop to keep from throwing it across the room. He opened the second email, dated 3 weeks later. "I found out today that I'm pregnant. Twins. The doctor says I'm about 8 weeks along, which means I conceived them right before I kicked you out. I'm sitting here with the ultrasound photos, looking at these 2 little heartbeats, and all I can think is that I've destroyed their chance at having a father. But I can't tell you. Marcus came to see me yesterday. He knows I know the truth, and he made it very clear that if I go public, if I try to bring you back, Vivian Cross has enough fabricated evidence to bury both of us. She'll claim you were working with me on insider trading. She has documents, recordings, all of it fake, but convincing enough to trigger federal investigations. We'd both go to prison, and our children would be born while their mother is in a cell. So I'm choosing silence. I'm choosing to protect them, even if it means you never know they exist. I hate myself for this choice, but I'm making it anyway." The emails continued, a chronicle of cowardice dressed up as protection. Email after email detailing how Marcus had been on Cross Technologies' payroll for 2 years before the setup, how Vivian Cross had orchestrated everything because Anderson Industries was about to announce a breakthrough that would have bankrupted her company, how Brenda had hired her own investigators, confirmed Wesley's innocence down to the smallest detail, and then buried the truth to protect herself and her empire. Some would say Brenda was trapped by blackmail, that she made the only choice she could. Others would call it the ultimate betrayal, choosing her company over her family and hiding behind the excuse of protection. Where do you stand? Was she a victim or a villain? Comment below with your thoughts. There were emails about the twins' births, their first words, their first steps. Emails where Brenda confessed she'd almost told him 100 times and lost her courage every single time. Emails where she detailed Marcus's disappearance with his 7-figure payoff. Vivian Cross's eventual bankruptcy from market forces Brenda had quietly manipulated over years. Emails proving that by 2015, there was no more threat, no more blackmail, no more reason to keep the secret except her own shame and pride. 14 years of emails. 14 years of truth she'd known and never spoken. 14 years of his children growing up while she documented her guilt in words she'd never had the courage to send. Wesley read every single one, and with each email, something inside him calcified into a fury so cold it felt like dying all over again. She'd known, not just about his innocence, but about the blackmail, about Marcus, about everything. And when the threat disappeared, when there was nothing left to hide behind, she'd still chosen silence, had still kept his sons from him for 6 more years, because admitting the truth meant admitting what she'd done. The question that burned through him wasn't whether he could forgive her. It was whether anyone could forgive a betrayal this complete, this calculated, this utterly devastating in its implications. But what Wesley didn't know yet, what he would discover when he confronted her with these emails, was that Brenda had one more secret buried in those files. One final revelation that would force all of them to choose between the justice they deserved and the family they might still become. And that choice would determine whether the kidney beating in Wesley's chest had saved his life or simply prolonged his suffering. The laptop screen glowed in the darkening room. 43 emails testament to 15 years of lies, and Wesley Castillo had to decide what to do with the truth that was finally, devastatingly, his. Wesley didn't sleep that night. He read every email twice, then a third time, memorizing the dates and the lies and the moments when Brenda could have chosen differently, but didn't. By the time dawn broke over the estate, painting the sky in colors that felt like mockery, he'd made a decision that would either destroy them all or force them towards something that might eventually resemble healing. He printed every single email. 43 pages of confession that Brenda had never intended him to see. Then he asked the nurse to bring his sons to his recovery suite, telling her it was important, that it couldn't wait. Ethan and Adrian arrived within 20 minutes, still moving carefully from their own surgeries, their faces lighting up when they saw their father sitting up in bed, stronger than he'd been since the transplant. But their smiles died when they saw the stack of papers in his hands and the expression on his face. "Dad?" Ethan's voice was uncertain, the words still new enough to sound strange. "What's wrong?" "I need to show you something," Wesley said quietly. "And then we need to talk to your mother. Together." He handed them the emails, watching their faces as they read. Watched confusion turn to shock, turn to a betrayal so profound it seemed to age them years in minutes. Adrian's hands started shaking by the 3rd page. Ethan made it to page 7 before he had to sit down, his face gone white as fresh snow. "She knew," Adrian whispered, his voice hollow. "6 months after the divorce, she knew you were innocent, and she still kept you away from us. Still told us you'd made choices that hurt our family." still built our entire childhood on a lie she knew was a lie. Some would say the twins had a right to their anger. Others might argue they should consider the impossible position Brenda was in, trapped by blackmail and fear. But the question that mattered most was simpler. Can children forgive a parent who chose protecting an empire over telling the truth? What would you do in their position? "There's more," Wesley said, his voice rough. "Keep reading." They did, and with each page, the scope of Brenda's deception became clearer. The blackmail that had ended by 2015. The 6 years after that, where she'd kept the secret simply because admitting it meant facing what she'd done. The documentation of every milestone Wesley had missed, written like a confession to a priest who would never grant absolution. By the time they finished, both twins were crying, silent tears that tracked down their faces like accusations. "We need to hear this from her," Ethan said finally, his voice shaking but determined. "We need to look her in the eye and hear her explain how she did this to us, to all of us." Wesley pressed the call button for Brenda's private line, the one that connected directly to her office. She answered on the second ring, her voice careful in the way it had been since the surgery. "Wesley, do you need something? Is everything? Come to my recovery suite, now. Bring nothing, say nothing. Just come." He hung up before she could respond, and the three of them waited in silence that felt like the calm before an execution. Brenda arrived 7 minutes later, still in the clothes she'd clearly slept in, her hair uncombed, her face carrying the exhaustion of a woman who hadn't rested properly in weeks. She stopped in the doorway when she saw all three of them waiting, Wesley in the bed, and the twins flanking him like guards, united in a way that excluded her completely. "What's going on?" she asked, but her eyes had already found the printed emails on the bed, and the color drained from her face like someone had opened a valve. "You tell us," Adrian said, his voice cold and precise. "You tell us about the emails you wrote 15 years ago. The ones where you confessed you knew Dad was innocent 6 months after the divorce. The ones where you documented every moment of our lives that you stole from him. The ones you never sent because you're a coward who chose her pride over her family." Brenda swayed, actually physically swayed, and had to grip the doorframe to stay upright. "How did you—" "The laptop," Wesley said flatly. "The one you said was wiped for guest use. It wasn't. And now we all know exactly what kind of person you are. But what none of them knew yet, what Brenda was about to reveal in her desperation to make them understand, was that there was one more layer to this story, one final secret buried in those files that would reframe everything they thought they knew about her choices. "I was being blackmailed," Brenda said, the words tumbling out like a confession she'd held back too long. "Marcus and Vivian Cross had fabricated evidence that would have sent both of us to federal prison. I had to choose between telling you the truth and protecting our unborn children from being born while their mother was in a cell." "The blackmail ended in 2015, Ethan said, his voice shaking. "We read the emails, Mama. We know the threat was gone. And you still kept the secret for 6 more years. 6 years when you could have told the truth, but chose not to, because admitting it meant admitting what you'd done." "You're right." Brenda's voice cracked, and she finally stepped into the room, moving like a woman walking to her own sentencing. "You're absolutely right. I was a coward. I told myself I was protecting you, but I was protecting myself. From facing Wesley. From admitting I'd destroyed everything based on pride and suspicion. From having to look at my sons and explain that their entire childhood was built on my mistake." "Not a mistake," Wesley said, and his voice was ice. A choice. You made a choice every single day for 6 years to keep lying. Every birthday, every Christmas, every time they asked about their father, you chose the lie over the truth. Don't you dare call that a mistake. Some would say Brenda deserves a chance to explain the complexity of her position. Others would argue that no explanation can justify 15 years of deception. Where do you stand? Can fear and shame ever excuse this level of betrayal? Let me know in the comments. Tears were streaming down Brenda's face now, her carefully constructed armor finally shattered completely. I know I can't fix this. I know I destroyed 15 years we'll never get back. I know I'm the reason you grew up without your father, and he grew up without you. I know all of that, and I will carry it for the rest of my life. Knowing isn't enough, Adrian said, his voice breaking. You've known the whole time, and knowing didn't make you tell the truth. Knowing didn't make you do the right thing. Knowing just made you better at lying to us. What do you want from me? Brenda asked, and it was almost a scream. What can I possibly do to make this right? You can't, Wesley said simply. That's what you need to understand. You can't make this right. You can apologize, you can confess, you can spend the rest of your life trying to atone, but you cannot give back what you took. You cannot undo 15 years of damage. The question isn't whether you can fix this. It's whether we can find a way to move forward, knowing what you did. The silence that followed felt like the world holding its breath. I don't know if I can forgive you, Ethan said finally, his voice small and young and utterly devastated. You're my mother, and I love you, but I don't know if I can forgive this. You didn't just lie to us. You built our entire reality on a lie and then watched us live in it every single day. I know, Brenda whispered. But here's the thing I keep coming back to, Ethan continued, looking at his brother and then his father. We just spent a week cutting ourselves open to save Dad's life. We made that choice knowing it was dangerous, knowing it would hurt, knowing the scars would last forever. And we made it because he's our father. And family is supposed to mean something. He turned back to his mother, and Brenda saw something in his expression that might have been the beginning of understanding or might have been the end of trust. So the question isn't whether we can forgive you right now, it's whether we're willing to try, whether we're willing to take the family you almost destroyed and see if we can build something real from the pieces. But that only works if you stop lying. If you stop hiding, if you stop choosing pride over truth, starting right now. Some would call what Ethan was offering mercy. Others would say it was enabling a betrayal that should never be forgiven. But the truth was more complicated than either position allowed. This was a family trying to survive the wreckage of lies that had shaped all their lives, and there were no clean answers. No simple paths forward. Is there anything else? Wesley asked, his voice deadly quiet. Any other secrets you're holding back? Any other lies we need to know about before we decide if trying is even possible? Brenda looked at the three of them, at the family she'd fractured, and the truth that had finally caught up with her, and made a choice she should have made 15 years ago. Yes, she whispered. There's one more thing. She pulled a folder from her pocket, one she'd been carrying since the surgery, waiting for the courage to reveal it. Inside was a document dated from 2011, shortly after the twins were born. Marcus didn't just disappear with his payoff. I tracked him down 5 years ago, right before the statute of limitations expired on what he and Vivian did, and I had enough evidence to send them both to prison for corporate espionage, fraud, and blackmail. She handed the folder to Wesley with shaking hands. I chose not to prosecute, because by then, doing so would have exposed everything, including the twins, and I convinced myself I was protecting them. But the truth is, I was protecting myself again. From the scandal, from the questions, from having to admit publicly what I'd done to all of you. Wesley stared at the document, at proof that Brenda could have had justice 5 years ago and chosen silence instead. The betrayal had layers, each one deeper and more devastating than the last. "So you let them get away with it," he said, his voice hollow. "The people who destroyed our marriage, who blackmailed you, who stole 15 years from us, and you let them walk away free because prosecuting them would have been inconvenient for you." "Yes," Brenda whispered, and the word was barely audible. The twins looked at their mother like they were seeing a stranger, and maybe they were. Maybe they'd never really known her at all. But it was Wesley who spoke next, his voice carrying a weight that 15 years of grief and anger had forged into something unbreakable. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to move out of the master wing. You're going to give me and the boys space to decide if we can exist in the same house as you. You're going to stop making decisions for this family and start earning back the right to be part of it. And if we decide we can't forgive this, if we decide the damage is too deep to repair, you're going to accept that without argument. Because you don't get to choose how this ends anymore. That power belongs to the people you hurt." Brenda nodded, tears falling silently, every defense stripped away. "And one more thing," Adrian added, his voice stronger now. "No more secrets, no more lies, no more choosing what you think is best for us. If we're going to try to be a family, it has to be built on truth, even when the truth is ugly. Especially when the truth is ugly." "I promise," Brenda said, and for the first time in 15 years, the words felt like they might actually mean something. What none of them knew yet was whether promises made in the aftermath of devastation could hold against the weight of everything that had been broken. Whether forgiveness was even possible when the betrayal cut this deep. Whether a family could be built from people who had every reason to walk away from each other. But they were about to find out, because the hardest part wasn't the confrontation. It was what came after. It was learning to exist in the same space with someone who'd destroyed your trust. It was deciding every single day whether trying was worth the pain it would inevitably bring. The question facing all of them was brutal in its simplicity. Is love enough to bridge a betrayal this complete? And if it isn't, what does that mean for a family that's only just beginning to know each other? The answer would determine everything that came next. Subscribe if you believe people who finally tell the whole truth, even when it destroys them, deserve a chance at redemption. Only those who think confession without consequences is worthless won't subscribe. 3 months after the confrontation, on a morning that felt like the world offering a second chance, 4 people stood in the driveway of Anderson Estate with suitcases packed, and a future that belonged to all of them. Brenda had moved out of the master wing that same day she'd confessed everything, taking a small guest room in the south corner of the estate, like a tenant in her own home. The twins had needed space, and Wesley had needed silence, and she'd given them both without argument or defense. For 6 weeks, they'd existed in careful orbits around each other, polite and distant and achingly broken. But slowly, painfully, something had started to shift. It began with Wesley, of all people. 2 months into his recovery, strong enough now to walk the estate grounds without assistance, he'd found Brenda sitting alone in the garden at dawn, staring at nothing with the kind of emptiness that came from carrying guilt too heavy to set down. "I've been thinking about forgiveness," he'd said, not sitting, not getting too close, but not walking away either. And I realized something. Holding on to this anger is like drinking poison and expecting you to die. It's destroying me from the inside, and you're already destroyed. So what's the point? Brenda had looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes, and he'd seen in her face what 15 years of lies had cost her, not just their family, but herself. "I'm not saying I forgive you yet," Wesley had continued. "I'm saying I'm willing to try. For the boys, for the family we might still be able to build from this wreckage. But you need to understand something. Trust is earned back in inches, not miles. And it starts with you being honest even when the truth makes you look worse." Some would say Wesley was too forgiving, that betrayal this deep deserves permanent consequences. Others would argue that choosing to try was the bravest thing any of them could do. What's your take? Is forgiveness always possible, or are some betrayals too big to overcome? Let me know in the comments. The twins had been harder to convince. Adrian especially had held on to his anger like armor, refusing to let his mother close enough to hurt him again. But it was Ethan, always the more empathetic twin, who'd finally broken the stalemate. "I was reading Dad's medical records," he'd said one night at dinner, the four of them sitting together for the first time since the confrontation. "Did you know the genetic markers that made his kidney disease so rare are the same ones that made our match so perfect? The thing that was killing him is the thing we inherited that saved his life." He'd looked at his mother then, really looked at her, and Brenda had seen her son working through something complicated in real time. I think that's what this whole situation is, the thing that almost destroyed us. Your pride, your lies, your fear, that's also what's giving us a chance to be a family. Because if you hadn't been so terrified of facing what you'd done, we never would have been hidden away. And if we hadn't been hidden, we wouldn't have been tested when Dad needed donors. And he'd be dead right now instead of sitting at this table. Adrian had stared at his brother. "Are you seriously suggesting Mama's 15 years of lying was somehow meant to be?" "No," Ethan had said quietly. "I'm suggesting that sometimes the worst mistakes create the only path to something better. And we get to choose whether we take that path or stay stuck in the anger of what should have been different." But what really changed everything, what shifted the entire family towards something that might eventually resemble healing, was the day Brenda made her final confession. "I'm selling the estate," she'd announced 3 weeks ago, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was saying. "All of it. The main house, the grounds, everything. I've already contacted real estate agents." Wesley had looked up sharply. "This is your fortress, your kingdom. Why would you—" "Because it's a prison," Brenda had interrupted, her voice breaking slightly. "I built it to protect the boys, but really, I built it to hide from the consequences of my choices. Every wall, every gate, every security measure was just another way of avoiding the truth. And I can't heal here. We can't heal here. This place is soaked in 15 years of lies, and I think we need to start somewhere new. Somewhere that belongs to all of us, not just me." The twins had exchanged glances, that silent communication that still amazed Wesley every time he witnessed it. "Where would we go?" Adrian had asked, and the "we" in that question had been the first indication that maybe, just maybe, forgiveness was becoming possible. "I don't know," Brenda had admitted. "Somewhere normal. Somewhere the boys can have friends and go to actual schools and live lives that aren't shaped by my paranoia Somewhere we can figure out how to be a family without all this wealth and isolation getting in the way. Now, 3 months later, they stood in that driveway with the estate sold to a tech billionaire who'd probably fill it with even more security and secrets. The proceeds were being split 4 ways, Brenda had insisted, giving each of them enough to build whatever future they wanted, together or apart. "Last chance to change our minds," Wesley said, looking at the mansion that had been both sanctuary and prison for the twins' entire lives. "Not changing my mind," Ethan said firmly, throwing his suitcase into the SUV they'd bought together, a normal car for a family trying to learn how to be normal. "Me neither," Adrian added, and then, quieter, almost reluctant, "This place never felt like home anyway. It just felt like where we were stuck." Brenda stood apart from them slightly, still maintaining the distance she'd learned they needed, still earning back the right to stand close. But Wesley noticed how the twins gravitated toward her anyway, orbit correcting slowly, gravity pulling them back toward the woman who'd hurt them, but was finally, genuinely trying to be better. "So where are we going?" Brenda asked, and the uncertainty in her voice was so different from the commanding CEO who'd built an empire that Wesley almost didn't recognize her. "We were thinking Colorado," Ethan said, pulling out his phone to show her pictures they'd been researching. "There's a town outside Denver. Good schools, normal neighborhoods, mountains close enough for hiking. Dad found a house with enough room for all of us, but not so much that we're rattling around in separate wings, avoiding each other. It has a kitchen where we can all cook together," Wesley added, looking at Brenda carefully. "Like a real family, if that's something you want." The question hung in the air between them, fragile and frightening and full of possibility. "I want that," Brenda whispered. "More than anything, I want that." Some would say they were moving too fast, that forgiveness, this significant, needed more time. Others would argue that every day spent in the place that housed their pain was a day wasted. But the question that mattered most wasn't about timing. It was about whether broken people could build something whole together. They loaded the last of the suitcases, each of them taking one final look at the estate that had shaped their lives in ways both devastating and strange. Then Wesley started the engine, and the 4 of them drove away from the fortress Brenda had built, toward a future none of them could predict. But all of them had chosen. In the rearview mirror, the Anderson estate grew smaller, and with it, the weight of secrets that had nearly destroyed them all. "Can I ask you something?" Adrian said from the back seat, as they merged onto the highway. "What happens if this doesn't work? What happens if we get to Colorado and realize we can't actually forgive what happened?" It was Brenda who answered, her voice steady and honest in a way it hadn't been for 15 years. "Then we'll figure that out too, together, because trying and failing is better than never trying at all. And even if we can't be the family we should have been, maybe we can be the family we choose to become." Wesley reached over and, for the first time since the divorce, took Brenda's hand. Not forgiveness yet, not fully, but the beginning of something that might eventually get there. The twins watched from the back seat, and Ethan pulled out his phone to take a picture. "First family road trip," he said, and there was something in his voice that sounded like hope. "First of many," Wesley agreed, and he meant it. What none of them knew yet was that Colorado would bring its own challenges, that learning to be a family after 15 years of separation would be harder than any of them anticipated, that there would be fights and setbacks, and moments when walking away seemed easier than staying. But they also didn't know about the small victories waiting for them. The first dinner cooked together in their new kitchen. The first time Adrian called Brenda Mama without anger in his voice. The first time Wesley and Brenda laughed about something that had nothing to do with the past. The question that had haunted all of them since that desperate phone call 15 years after the divorce finally had an answer. Can you build a family from broken pieces? Can love survive betrayal this deep? Can forgiveness bridge gaps this wide? The answer was complicated and imperfect and achingly human. Sometimes, if you're willing to try, if you're willing to choose each other every day, even when it hurts, if you're willing to accept that some scars never fully heal, but can become part of a story about survival instead of destruction. As the SUV carried them toward Colorado and whatever future waited there, 4 people who'd been shattered by lies and pride and fear chose to believe that trying was enough. That family wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up, telling the truth, and doing the painful work of rebuilding trust one honest moment at a time. And maybe, just maybe, that was the greatest act of courage any of them had ever attempted. The estate disappeared completely in the rearview mirror, and with it, the gilded cage that had protected nothing and imprisoned everyone. Ahead lay ordinary houses and normal schools, and a life without walls high enough to hide from the truth. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be perfect. But it would be real. And for a family built on 15 years of lies, real was exactly what they needed. What happens next for the Anderson Castillo family is uncertain. Therapy will be hard. Trust will be fragile. There will be days when walking away seems easier than staying. But they've chosen the harder path, and that choice, repeated daily, earned in inches, built on honesty, even when it hurts, might be the only thing powerful enough to heal what was broken. Or it might not be enough. Time will tell, and that uncertainty, that realistic acknowledgement that happy endings aren't guaranteed just because people want them, is perhaps the most honest part of their story. Some betrayals are too big to forgive. Some families can't be fixed. But this one is going to try. And in the trying, they might discover that redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about choosing differently in the present, one painful, honest moment at a time. What do you think happens to this family a year from now? Do they make it, or does the weight of Brenda's betrayal eventually pull them apart? Drop your prediction in the comments. I want to hear your take on whether forgiveness like this is even possible. Subscribe if you believe broken families can heal, if everyone chooses honesty over pride. Only those who think some betrayals are too big to overcome will walk away without subscribing.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.